Hello people of the internet, this is Shaky Jake, and I really need a catchphrase. Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon defined the PlayStation brand in its early days when it came to platformers. Together they rivaled both Nintendo and Sega and the likes of Mario and Sonic the Hedgehog as the alternative platformer mascot characters. When I was a kid, Mario and Sonic never really grabbed my attention in the same way that Crash and Spyro did, and part of me wonders if that was because at that one point they dominated the part of the games industry that I was more aware of back then. In the midst of all of this, other mascot characters existed on multiple platforms such as Croc, Gex and Rayman, yet they didn't quite reach the same powerhouse level as Crash and Spyro did, although Rayman carried on fairly successfully for the most part. In spite of this, the Bandicoot and the Dragon seemed to receive the most attention on the PlayStation. I can still remember a time when Crash and Spyro seemed to be everywhere at one stage, whether it was for advertising and marketing or just discussions with other people my age sharing our experiences with these characters and their games. These characters made an impression on a lot of people's childhoods, even if they only play games more casually or not at all today. Naughty Dog and Insomniac games both deserve a lot more credit than they often end up with for helping revolutionise 3D platformers in its early stages alongside Nintendo with Super Mario 64. After my last big video, I felt that more needed to be said about why Crash and Spyro meant so much to me personally, why both characters and their games under both Naughty Dog and Insomniac games had defined a good part of my childhood, and why I stopped playing any new Crash and Spyro games after the original PlayStation era, before eventually coming back for their remakes. Where I am as a fan is debatable, as some people claim you have to buy every single product and experience every single release, but I consider myself a fan in the sense that I enjoyed at least 3 games for both characters and played them for multiple years up to at least a decade after their original releases. My opinion on this is not the definitive one, nor is it one that everyone will agree with, but there may be others who feel the same way or have had similar thoughts. I am not trying to cheapen anybody else's experiences for those who continue to enjoy the games or support the Crash and Spyro franchises, so if you are one of those people who continue to enjoy them beyond the earlier games, then that's absolutely fine. I won't necessarily agree as to why, but I can understand the reasoning behind it if the later games meant as much to people as the earlier ones did for me. To give some background into my experiences with Crash and Spyro, I didn't have a PlayStation straight away, and beforehand I was playing games on my PC with a bit of the Game Boy for the likes of Pokemon Red on the side. When I did end up with a PlayStation, I still didn't play Crash or Spyro straight away, as they were not the first games I played on the system. A few months into 2000, I ended up playing Crash Bandicoot Warped for the first time thanks to borrowing it and loving it. The gameplay was relatively simple, the mechanics were all polished, and the engine functioned in a way that was user-friendly and never off-putting. It also had great characters and an enjoyable storyline that is still memorable even now. I was hooked and ended up with Crash Team Racing afterwards, and then the order I think I got the remaining games in was Crash Bandicoot, Crash Bash and Crash Bandicoot 2 Cortex Strikes Back right at the very end. All of these games were fantastic, although I never completed Crash Bandicoot due to its brutal lack of ability to actually save and how I never felt at ease with it in a way I did with its sequels. It wasn't until the Crash Bandicoot N-Sane trilogy that I actually completed the first game due to a much more forgiving save system. As for the other games, they were much more enjoyable to play thanks to a more tolerable difficulty. I came close to getting 100% on each of them, but never quite reaching it due to the difficulty curve becoming much stricter towards the end, especially with Crash Team Racing and Crash Bash. Talking about Crash Bash, despite it not being developed by Naughty Dog and instead being worked on by Eurocom, who seemed to be a studio that developed every other game for years and somehow released a ton of games without ever fully compromising on the quality, good or bad, it was still a game I had a lot of time for and was addicted to it for at least a year and a half. The variety of minigames Crash Bash had actually felt different to the earlier games, while still retaining the charm of those early Naughty Dog titles. If I looked at it today, I would probably be much less generous to it, but it still functions as well as the earlier games. Then there was Spyro the Dragon, who I experienced a few months after I played Crash Bandicoot Warped. I played each Spyro game in reverse order, so I started with Spyro Year of the Dragon, then Spyro 2 Gateway to Glimmer, as it was known in the UK for me, and finally Spyro the Dragon. Once again, all three of these games were fantastic and played extremely well with polished gameplay mechanics and an engine that functioned in the same user-friendly way that the Crash games did. Spyro Year of the Dragon was the first game I ever got to 100% completion on, which at the time, being a kid, was a pretty big deal, and I came very close to it in Spyro 2 a year or two later. The only exception to this was Spyro the Dragon, which I got much later on and a generation later than its release, so I never quite played it to anywhere near the same extent as its sequels. I enjoyed it, but perhaps I had been spoilt by the refinements that Insomniac Games had made with each game, so never really got into that first game as much as I should have done. Either way, all three of these games were extremely enjoyable for me personally. Now, with both Crash and Spyro, these really early games made a huge impact on me as a kid growing up, and I continued to play them up until at least 2009 or so, even as newer games were being released before I finally upgraded to newer hardware. These early 8 games combined from both series are all very good and still hold up very well, being just as enjoyable to play even now 20 years later. Except for those camera controls in Spyro, how on earth did we all put up with L2 and R2 to control the camera back then? Plus the unforgiving difficulty in Crash Bandicoot, which I'm grateful for it getting toned down both in the sequels and its remake for different reasons. Anyway, by the time Crash and Spyro had made the transition to being multi-platform titles on the PlayStation 2, Xbox and GameCube in the early 2000s, and were now being developed by completely different developers, that is where I personally noticed the problems that were happening with these games. I was 10 years old in 2002 by the time that both of these games had been released, and if I was being critical of them at that age after years of being able to tolerate even the most flawed games ever developed, and believe me, I had tolerated a few games that are, by most people's standards, awful, then something must have been off. I just want to make a few things explicitly clear before I go into why I stopped playing Crash and Spyro games. My life did not revolve around these two characters, and I had many more interests, both in gaming and otherwise. Crash and Spyro were not the only series I enjoyed, nor were they the only reason I got into gaming in the first place. I was not going to be negatively affected personally if I no longer enjoyed these two series, because I had other games that I enjoyed playing much more and had more fun with, as well as other interests. People are entitled to not spend their money on a product if they feel let down by it, or even if they have a much greater interest in other things by that point. There are people who, for example, swore off watching new Star Wars films again after being disappointed by what Disney did with Star Wars Episode 7 The Force Awakens, just as an example. Do I agree? Not really, as I personally like the vast majority of what Disney have done with Star Wars so far. But I can understand why people would not want to actively support the franchise as they once did, and if they feel that they can no longer enjoy it personally. Consumers are entitled to be disappointed by a product and not support it further if they have other interests, and as a consumer, I should not feel obligated to continue buying something because of my disappointment in a product alongside my tastes changing at the same time. In this instance, I don't owe Crash and Spyro anything beyond what I ended up playing, or if I choose to purchase anything else of theirs later on down the line. Until today, I didn't even realise how many games were released for Crash between 1996 and 2010, and Spyro between 1998 and 2008. It's insane how these games had annual releases every single year until they both, pun intended, crashed and burned. The amount of games that these two characters have makes Sonic look almost restrained in comparison, and I say that as someone who doesn't particularly like that series. It was inevitable that Crash and Spyro needed a huge break before the general audience could appreciate them again. I get the impression that most of the Crash and Spyro games after 2000 were being developed for a more hardcore niche market as opposed to the general audience that used to exist under Naughty Dog and Insomniac Games. Regardless of whether or not you like or dislike the later games, there is a clear distinction between which games resonated more with people and which games struggled to establish themselves in the games industry in the same way, but were targeted more towards specific fandoms. Anyway, on to the reasons why I stopped playing Crash and Spyro. When I played on the PlayStation 2, I played a variety of games. My game library was a bit more diverse at that stage, but I still tried Crash Bandicoot The Wrath of Cortex and Spyro Enter the Dragonfly with no expectations or hype other than the interest I had in both series previously. Needless to say, I was completely and utterly disappointed with what I had played. I am all for upgrading dated gameplay mechanics and developing new engines to succeed older ones as the technology and support improves, particularly in a new generation, but with Crash and Spyro it was a huge problem. The Wrath of Cortex and Enter the Dragonfly felt like a slap in the face to me as a kid after how good the previous games were, and in some cases almost an unintentional parody of the earlier games, trying to emulate what made those games so good but failing to actually make them fun or remotely playable in some cases. The Wrath of Cortex, for example, looked far less clear and colourful than Warped did, and I find it hard to imagine anyone preferring the grungier look over what the earlier games had. The Wrath of Cortex also made bizarre design choices such as the loading screen aesthetics, reducing the use of certain memorable characters such as Tiny Tiger and Dingodile within the plot for no reason whatsoever, and fairly repetitive boss fights with the whole crunch and an additional elemental mask deal. There was far less charm with the warp room structure this time around than in Cortex Strikes Back and Warped, yet there's no fathomable reason as to why that should have been the case when it apes the earlier games considerably. The loading times were also embarrassing in comparison to the previous games. I know that this appears to only be an issue with the PS2 version, which is the only version I have played, but even so, there was no excuse for the game to take almost half a minute to a minute to load a single level up on average. The assets cannot have been that demanding, especially in the same age that games such as Grand Theft Auto 3, which was a huge game at the time, were being released, and had much more going for it than the Wrath of Cortex did. By the time an average Wrath of Cortex level loaded, I would have already made a good start on any level from the previous Crash games, and by the time a level from the game loaded, I was wishing I was playing those earlier games instead. Then the overall control scheme felt much heavier than they needed to for whatever reason, and not anywhere near as fluid as it had done during the first three Crash games, which don't have the most perfect controls ever, but they're still more fluid than what the Wrath of Cortex displayed. To be fair though, there are a couple of aspects of the game that I liked. Some of the additional gameplay mechanics that were included were a positive sign of trying to take the games in a new direction with the rolling inside a ball level, which, whilst I personally disliked it, at least it was an attempt to add more variety to the gameplay. Crunch was also a fairly cool concept for a character to rival the likes of Wario and Shadow the Hedgehog to act as a dark mirror to Crash. Most importantly, Coco finally had more diverse gameplay similar to what Uacom did for her in Crash Bash, and made her more interesting to actually use in comparison to how she was more limited in Warped. Now, Traveller's Tales did their best developing Wrath of Cortex, and in many ways they were a suitable developer choice for Crash Bandicoot at the time. They had developed some fun movie tie-ins that were platformers, such as A Bug's Life that I played on PC, and Toy Story 2 Buzz Lightyear to the Rescue that I played on the PS1. And those were really fun to play without the irritations that the Wrath of Cortex had. But somehow the Wrath of Cortex didn't work in the same way that those earlier titles did. However, Traveller's Tales have continued to be successful in the games industry, being primarily responsible for the LEGO games, which are actually really good if you've never played them. Sure, they're buggy as hell and quite repetitive if you play every single one, and as annual releases, they can be tiresome to play every single year, but at the same time, they avoid most of the problems that Wrath of Cortex has. Moving on to Spyro Enter the Dragonfly, this was one of the first games I can actually remember being so bad in a lot of ways, to the point where I got rid of it a few weeks later. I wasn't even aware that it suffered from being rush released until recently, but even in the state it ended up in, it's awful, and I say that as someone who loves Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2 The Sith Lords, which had similar development issues. How people are saying it had the potential to be great baffles me. Even if it were polished, you would still have a game that had a worse engine than either of the original three Spyro games, with much worse aesthetics, a game that still performed worse via clunkier gameplay mechanics, and a storyline that still would have likely been pretty awful. About the only positive thing I can say about Enter the Dragonfly is the title. Referencing Bruce Lee and his filmography is a cool way to make a game sound awesome. Just a shame it's attached to a game this bad. After playing both Wrath of Cortex and Enter the Dragonfly, those games made me realise how much better the earlier games actually were, and in some cases actually raised my appreciation for them. So after trying my best to find some enjoyment factor from these newer games for several weeks, I eventually gave up and went back to the original games instead. From there, I also lost interest in any further new Crash or Spyro games, as I found the ones that I had enjoyed years earlier already gave me a satisfying experience, as well as how I was opening up to a more diverse range of interests whilst playing lots of new games from other series. I remember reading a few gaming magazines a couple of years later about the likes of Crash Twinsanity and Spyro Hero's Tale, just as an example, and I barely gave them a second glance. Can I judge how good or bad these games are without playing them? No, not really. Naturally I can't because I haven't played them. But based on what I have seen and what I have read, it doesn't really look as if I missed much. I don't regret not playing any of the newer Crash and Spyro games, and I wouldn't lose my experiences with other games that I enjoyed just to play these games I missed out on, which would have been less likely to have been anywhere near as good. Now, just as an example, I'm going to talk about Wrath of Cortex and Enter the Dragonfly one last time before I move on. Both games were fully released by 2002, so I will be bringing up a few other games released a year before or after to make a comparison with. I know these games aren't from the same genre necessarily, but they are all sequels or have alternative interpretations of the source material, and in some cases have been developed by a different developer. The question I pose is this: can you honestly say that Wrath of Cortex and Enter the Dragonfly are good games? And when I say good games, I mean just good games. Ignore the fact they're Crash and Spyro games. Can you honestly say that Wrath of Cortex and Enter the Dragonfly are good games compared to, say, Grand Theft Auto 3, Max Payne 2 The Fall of Max Payne, Prince of Persia The Sands of Time, Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, or Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic? I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about this. Okay, all of these other games I have mentioned all either push the games industry further with new advancements, such as the sandbox of GTA 3, Max Payne 2's already existing bullet time mechanic being improved further to combine with ragdoll physics, or alternatively, the other examples I gave, they were great interpretations of previous material. I don't even like Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire much, and that's potentially another video in the future as to why I don't, but I won't deny that it massively improved on the earlier Pokemon games with its mechanics, and it was a lot more polished and less buggy than those earlier games that I like so much more. Prince of Persia The Sands of Time was a great reinterpretation of the Prince of Persia games, and Knights of the Old Republic expanded the Star Wars universe further and gave a completely different context to it. Why would I, or anybody else for that matter, give up those games for mediocre games like the Wrath of Cortex or Enter the Dragonfly, and any possibility that further games would be of a similar mediocre design? So I never played any new Crash or Spyro games again until 2017 with the Crash Bandicoot N-Sane trilogy, and I'm equally looking forward to the Spyro Reignited trilogy this year, regardless of the fact that these games are being published by Activision, a publisher who is second to EA in terms of being anti-consumer with their business practices. I'm still irritated that I had to pay money to have the revert trick in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD, for example, which is a game that Activision ultimately published, despite it being a given gameplay mechanic that was always in every single Tony Hawk's Pro Skater game before then, apart from the first game. But so far, there's nothing particularly offensive about these remakes yet, from trying to heavily milk the consumer or to force consumers to pay for further content that's necessary for the games. I know some people will disagree with me on that, but I don't feel as if I'm being ripped off or anything along those lines. Now, ignoring Stormy Ascent for the Crash Bandicoot N-Sane trilogy, it's a level that never made it to the original game, so that was fairly priced for what it was, even though I did actually get it for free because of the trial that was on at the time. I don't want to play these new Crash and Spyro remakes just because they were heavily based on the original games, but because developers are using them as a way to potentially create similar new Crash and Spyro games in the future, should Activision actually realise the potential that these two characters have, as well as reinterpret these classics for people who appreciated them originally and to incorporate a whole new audience. I enjoyed the N-Sane trilogy and thought it was a great reinterpretation of the original games. There are some flaws, obviously. The unskippable cutscenes booting up the game is irritating, the loading times are slightly irritating, but they're not at Wrath of Cortex's level, and sometimes the physics with the controls feel a tad heavy, but otherwise Crash hasn't looked this confident and secure since about 2000. I am hoping that the Spyro Reignited trilogy does the same thing for Spyro. Hopefully new games will be following these characters again and avoid the fate that they originally received after the PlayStation era. Because it would be better for everybody involved if Crash and Spyro were both enjoyed by a mainstream audience again and not just their respective hardcore fandoms. If Crash and Spyro can make a comeback again on the strength of these remakes, then everybody wins, and ultimately all I want for the industry is for good games to be developed, published and supported. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.